that I think I and all the folks up here that I've in one way or another have worked with as well, we've all worked together at times. These questions of memory and history and memory and reclamation are really so critical, and as historians, how to balance the traditional, conventional expectations of how to do history and what counts as history and what's reliable and what's not, or what I call refracted testimony, the sort of shards of memory that exist in the record, and how do we fit the pieces back together in ways that reconstruct the stories that have been deliberately or maybe sometimes inadvertently wiped out. But Chattahoochee Brick is just a case study in all of those issues, where it was a place, a lot more people know about it today than they did some years ago, but Chattahoochee Brick was a forced labor camp out on the Chattahoochee River that was owned by the most prominent man in Atlanta, who had been the mayor of Atlanta in the 1880s, the wealthiest family in Atlanta, white man, as goes without saying, but that exploited the convict leasing system, which was ostensibly a form of punishment for people who convicted of crimes, but of course was not really that at all. It was a part of a system of injustice designed to be that for African Americans. And Chattahoochee Brick was a brick factory that produced millions and millions and millions of bricks from the 1880s up into modern times, but it made use of forced labor primarily coming from the criminal justice system and overwhelmingly African American men. It made use of that kind of forced labor from its inception until the 1910s, and thousands and thousands of men and overwhelmingly men in that place, but there were women who were sent to some related enterprises, were forced to work there under horrifying conditions, where they were starved and whipped and beaten and deprived of medical care and decency, and their bodies, tossed aside when they died or no one claimed them. It was a nightmare of a place that had been also a place that generated tremendous wealth for certain people in Atlanta, and was a core part of the industrial development of Atlanta and the creation of the city, new version of Atlanta that was emerging at the beginning of the 20th century. And so Chattahoochee Brick was at the center of those terrible, terrible practices. And the wealth that it generated, without going into the circuitous lines of how these things connect, but the money that it made, and its biggest customer, of course, was the city of Atlanta. And the city of Atlanta bought from Chattahoochee Brick hundreds of millions of bricks that were then used to pave the streets of Atlanta and the sidewalks of Atlanta. I live in Grant Park, and the sidewalks of Atlanta, Grant Park, much of them are still the original brick sidewalks from the 1890s, the early 1900s, and that all came from Chattahoochee Brick. If you go out to Oakland Cemetery, it's a festival of Chattahoochee Brick everywhere you turn. The bricks in the chimneys of my house and the footings almost certainly came from Chattahoochee Brick. So, and that's why the introduction to my book, titled Slavery by Another Name, the introduction is called The Bricks We Stand On, because particularly in a place like Atlanta, we are in downtown Atlanta, and I work at Georgia State now. I say to students there all the time, you're walking on the work of those people who were forced into this system, even still today. And very frequently, when you see some street construction going on, I'll stop and peek at the hole in the ground, and very, very often there's a layer of brick that's still there, under a few layers of asphalt or concrete. And so it's something that is at the heart of the story of Atlanta. And for me, it's really representative of the degree to which that unfree labor, both in times of slavery, but then in some respects even more so after the ostensible end of slavery, just how central forced labor, unfree labor, a corrupt criminal justice system, and all of the attendant things that surrounded that, just how such a primary element that is in the creation of the Atlanta that we know today. And how the wealth that was generated through those practices flowed into things that became enterprises that most of us do business with today. Georgia Power, Truist Bank was centrally connected to all of these events.
Coca-Cola Company in somewhat more roundabout ways. But enterprises that we still are very aware of root back into these terrible, terrible practices. And so that's the work that I'm doing now. I probably hit my 7 minutes. I'll try to stop. But I teach now at Georgia State, but as part of what I do there is I direct something that we call the Narrating Justice Project, which is an effort to create an interdisciplinary approach to the telling of stories, very similar to some of what you've heard talked about here today, but the telling of stories about issues of social justice, not just history, but issues of social justice, but how to tell those stories in powerful ways and how to bring together different disciplines, including a lot of very modern and to some degree beyond my capacities ways of telling stories, a little bit like the app that we just heard about. But so one thing that has come out of that is a collaboration with Dr. Myrick Harris and the Center for Civil and Human Rights, and hopefully others who are in the room now and others beyond that, is a what I call unfree labor in the making of modern Atlanta, but an effort to examine that issue. And so I teach a couple of classes that relate to this. Through the Center for Civil and Human Rights, we're launching a more elaborate research project that is essentially attempting to answer some of the primary questions that still remain from both a conventional historical sense and also a more spiritual and gap-filling approach. But to look in Georgia specifically at a body of data that has become available that is the written record of arrests all across Georgia, beginning in 1817 and continuing all the way to 1976. And this is a record that's not complete, but has been digitized now by Ancestry.com, who we hope will also be a collaborator in all this. But then it includes about 300,000 names of individuals in that period of time who were forced into some version of the Georgia penal system, but looking specifically at the period of time that convict leasing was happening, and even more specifically, this first phase of it, to look in Fulton County and at Chattahoochee Brick and the site of the old Bellwood Quarry, which was the Fulton County chain gang camp. And we've already extracted from that database a much better understanding of how many people were sent to these places during that period of time, breaking down even just the racial and other demographic data of those folks. And of course, among women who went to these places, it was 9-to-1 black women versus white women. Among men, it was 2/3 African Americans, 1/3 white. Those are things that we already would expect. But what we're now doing is, and this summer and the following summer, we'll hire undergraduate students. So, and we're looking for opportunities to do that, not limited to Georgia State, but we'll create these undergraduate research teams to continue a process of identifying individuals from that historical record, and then trying to reanimate them, try to bring life back to these obscure names. And then the last part of that, it's not exactly central to this project, but through the folks where I am at Georgia State, who are doing a tremendous amount of digital visualization work, we've already started on a related project of creating a virtual reality, historically grounded digital version of Chattahoochee Brick, which I've begun to see the creation, what that looks like. We haven't shown it to anybody else, but it's a stunning kind of thing to be able to, in a sense, walk back out onto that now desolate site and see those structures as we have reconstructed them from the historical record. And as we gather more of this historically based information about individuals, we will experiment with trying to populate that digital world with some of these actual individuals. And a lot of questions that attach to that kind of an effort. But very much in keeping, I think, with the theme of what you've been hearing about at this conference.
Thank you, Mr. Blackman. Next, I want to move to Ms. Stephens. Talk to us about your motivation in becoming involved in the work related to the Chattahoochee Brick Company, and what have you been doing over the last decade around the history and in relation to environmental justice issues?
Hello? Can you hear me? Okay. Hello, everyone. It's great to see you here today. Okay. Hi, it's great to see you guys here today. Thank you so much. Um, my story starts with a random Saturday. My sister and I are a bit of nerds, and we were watching PBS, and Doug's documentary came on, Slavery by Another Name. We were like, what is that? We've never heard of that before. So we sat and we patiently watched it, and we were just appalled. Because we'd always wondered why we lived in English Park. And who was English? And why did he, we have a neighborhood and we have a park, English Park. We just said, what is that? So we found that out that day. We found out the history of Chattahoochee brick. I'm a native Atlantan, so I'd always heard about men going to work at Chattahoochee brick in the modern era. And slowly but surely, the information just kind of like multiplied. Everywhere I looked, it seemed to be something attached to those two themes. And I'm on the board for Groundwork Atlanta, and we were having a meeting one morning, and the announcement was made that Lincoln Energy had purchased the Chattahoochee brick site. Groundwork Atlanta is an environmentally concerned nonprofit. So the first thing was, we can't let them build this fuel transfer system on the banks of the Chattahoochee River. We just can't allow that to happen. But then Doug's documentary was playing in my head, and I was like, God, there's historical and cultural reasons why we can't let this happen either. And again, slowly but surely, the bits and pieces started aligning themselves. I'd say the stars lined up. And over the course of time, I just kept telling people, whoever, if it was one-to-one, if it was a room of small room people, I was just telling everybody, look, this is what's going on. And everybody was looking at me like, what are you talking about? No, that didn't happen. And I was like, yes, it did. And I'm a graduate of Georgia State University, I'm proud to say. And I had learned through the African American Studies Department bits and pieces of Atlanta history that was not taught on the elementary and high school level. So those things started lining up. And I was like, oh, okay, so the slave codes became the black codes, and the 13th Amendment, oh, there's a clause, and all these things started happening. And again, I just kept telling people. And one of my fellow board members, Bob Kent, and I, we became like a duo, a team. And he strongly suggested I start a Facebook page. I didn't really think anything of it. I was like, nobody's going to look at that. And he insisted, so I just started playing around with that. And again, as time went by, I connected with individuals that you see here on the stage and other people, city council people, MPU people, and the network got larger and larger and larger, became larger and larger. And ironically, during COVID, of all things, that's when we had our big growth spurt. I don't know whether it's because people were tied to social media as much as, a lot more or what, but it became a bigger instance. And I'd like to count I just want to say something because they're here. Bob called me one day and said, hey, you got time to talk to Doug Blackman? And I was like, whoa, who? Because I see the documentary. I was impressed. Pulitzer Prize winner. I love to read. And I was like, what are you talking about? He said, well, he wants to know, can he, talk to him about something? And I said, okay. So we made an appointment, and he called me, and he was just like, well, you think you can be down here Thursday at 11 o'clock? And I was like, that's tomorrow. And I was like, sure. And that was the taping of Crucial Conversations. And this is when I met my friend, Karcheik. And the three of us were on stage. Vanessa, I can't remember her last name. She was the chief legal officer for Norfolk Southern. At this point, Norfolk Southern had acquired a lease to replicate what Lincoln Terminal was unsuccessful in getting. And within a year, the city was able to purchase the property and save the land. And we're still, and then shortly after that, I met Anthony. And then shortly after that, I met Darrin, DJ. So we're a big happy family, I like to say. But I'd like to say that if there's something that you feel passionate about, that keeps you up at night, don't dismiss that. Because I tell people all the time, I always thought I would be the person at the door. Please sign in. Here's an agenda. Make yourself comfortable. And, well, I get to be around people like this every day fighting for a necessary clause, because there are people who believe that there are remains on the property, who don't really believe there are remains on the property. There are people who are asking me, well, when is the park going to be finished? And I was just like, these things take time. There are stages to this. And even though people don't like the Facebook page, people come up to me and they say, you're not posting as much as you used to. What's going on? And I was like, but you never like anything. And they're like, I know, but I read it. And I was like, oh, so that motivates me to keep communicating via Facebook or attending events like this, because I really want people to understand, especially in this climate where we're banning books and we're holding information hostage. It's very important to let people know and to share ideas, because you might have an idea and the person sitting next to you on a MARTA train might have an idea. And if you connect those two ideas, then you have a theory or something bigger than yourselves to work on.
Thank you for that, Ms. Stephens. Thank you. I want to transition to Mr. Knight. Mr. Knight, how and why did the city of Atlanta get involved in excavating this history? And what is the city doing specifically in addressing the history of the Chattahoochee Brick Company?
So I'll start by saying I am with the Historic Preservation Studio, which is housed within the Office of Design. The Office of Design, in turn, is housed within the Department City of Planning. Just before COVID, or right at the onset of COVID, the City of Atlanta, the Department of City Planning, engaged in a study of its preservation practices, a study that had not been done since the 80s. And so out of that study, which is called the Future Places Project, came tons of information, and you can access it. I think the website is atlantafutureplaces.com. You can see all the studies and so forth. But a couple of important things came out of the study. One was that the city needed to center, in a better way, African American history, given the composition of the city and its history. What also came out of that study was that a position like mine needed to be created, a person who could help the city stay focused on preservation efforts as they relate to African American history and culture, and identify those places and spaces that we need to think about in terms of historic preservation. My background is not in planning, although we have a lot of capable professional planners in our department and others who are the kinds of professionals who can undertake the kind of work that the Chattahoochee Brick Company represents. But my background is in museum education, and so I come at this with a particular eye on how to provide information to the public. And so it's much too long to go into the whys and the hows of how the city acquired the property. But the city did acquire the property. Council passed legislation in April of 2022. The efforts were begun, I believe, with Mayor Bottoms' administration, ended with Mayor Dickens' administration, and the property was acquired in August of 2022. Since then, we've undergone a number of efforts. There are a number of people within the Department of City Planning who are looking at how we can best preserve the riverlands component of the property, as well as individuals, and I'm one of those individuals, who are looking to figure out how best to memorialize the atrocities that Doug spoke to regarding the Chattahoochee Brick Company and its practices. 3 departments purchased the property. So we say the city, but there were actually 3 specific departments that put up the money to purchase the property. The Department of City Planning, of which I'm a part, the Department of Watershed Management, and the Department of Parks and Recreation. So those 3 entities together with stakeholders like Donna and Karcheik and DJ and Doug, those 3 entities, with the help of a number of stakeholders throughout the city, will be focusing over the next few years on how best to use the property so that the public can gain access to it, since part of it will be a park. But we're also going to be thinking specifically about the best way to memorialize the history of the Chattahoochee Brick Company and the people who worked and perhaps even died there. A challenging part of it's ironic perhaps in a way that the city of Atlanta that made use of the bricks and helped to build the wealth that James English attained in his life. It's ironic that the city now owns that property, and I know Mayor Dickens, as well as many others throughout the city, are committed to ensuring that this property tells a better kind of story and kind of reckons with its own participation in that history. So that's what I know the city is committed to. We are starting actually a week from this coming Saturday, February 17th. We've put together a slate of education programs, which is something that I'm spearheading, that helps the public understand not only what the city has done from the time it purchased the property in August of 2022, but also, and Dr. Myrick Harris is going to be our keynote speaker on that Saturday to help us think about the importance of memorializing these kinds of histories. But also we're going to look at the broader history of the Chattahoochee Brick Company site. Before there was a James English, before there was a Chattahoochee Brick Company, before there was a United States, there were Native peoples for whom this property, for whom the Chattahoochee River formed an important part of their culture. So we're going to kind of take a long step back and look at the history of that site from the time of Native peoples who made their lives there until the present, and what that present means, the purchasing of brick by a city of Atlanta and many others to build a city that perhaps brick could be a metaphor of the segregation and racialization of Atlanta's history. So we're going to take a broad scope over the next 5 months, 1 program per month, and I invite you all to participate in those activities, and that's kind of it for right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Knight. Mr. Sims, talk to us about what is the Truth and Transformation Initiative of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, and what work are you doing related to the Chattahoochee Brick Company? In addition to that, how are you interfacing with the City of Atlanta and community to achieve your goals?
Thank you. I want to start by saying thank you so much to Dr. Harris and the MJ team for putting on this conference and this amazing panel. The whole day's been amazing. I'll start really by posing a question just to ask for you to think about. But really, do we tell the truth well? Have we ever in this country? And I ask that because as Idris displayed, the way we memorialize and talk about history in this country is really under attack. And there are so many good people in communities all over this country that are working very hard to protect and honor their history, our history. Something I learned from Doug is the language of collective history and individual history. Collective history is a history we share. Individual history is your own individual history. And when I think about Chattahoochee Brick specifically, there are actual families that have an individual connection to that site, and there are stories that they don't know. There are people who have disappeared. There are people who were chased out of the city with the threat of incarceration at Chattahoochee Brick and other sites like that. The reason for Truth and Transformation, I'm the director of that, a part of the National Center, is really how can we work to tell the truth so we can transform our future. And that is our collective future, the future that we all share together. And this really came out of really witnessing the targeted attacks that we were seeing all across the country as different communities, school boards, historical organizations, academic academies really began to modify and change the way that they were allowing certain history to be talked about. And then we also began to look at what history was beginning to be omitted or forgotten about. You know, in Atlanta, there's an amazing group, and a lot of them actually are really in this room, that are doing work to really honor and bring awareness and continue to bring awareness to the 1906 Atlanta Race Massacre, and how we began to meet so many people and students that had no idea that a massacre took place inside the city of Atlanta, of all places. And then to also learn and understand that forced labor is responsible for the creation of Atlanta. And that's not a narrative that you would hear at all. And we begin to really understand it and have conversations about that. And so the work that we're doing really is around education. How can we best create educational resources to accompany the history that's working in communities? We're actually working in partnership with Morehouse and Dr. Nina Gilbert to actually create the first Georgia standard aligned curriculum on forced labor that will be targeted and focused on Chattahoochee Brick Site and Bellwood Quarry. And we're also working in partnership with Doug Blackman and his students to everything Doug said, but one additional element is to identify descendants, people who have a direct connection with the site that may not know, and working on a process to how do we engage them with this history, because this is their history as well. Working with community engagement with the city of Atlanta, so how do we want to educate the community on this, but how do we want the community to inform the city's process on a memorial or the conversation? Because one thing that we've also seen in different communities that are doing this work is that when a process is done that the community is not involved in, it's not received or accepted. And a part of this work of memorialization, you know, one thing I talk about with Ms. Donna is there is no rule book for this work. There is no kind of there's no kind of best practices guide yet. We hope to work with partners to create that. And so that's really the work we do with Truth and Transformation, and how the center can really be a support, but how we can create educational resources that can really help both the community learn, but also students and educators, and also so how other communities can learn how can we do this work, and how can we do it in community, and how can we do it better and be stronger together. So.
Thank you for that. Next, I want to touch on Dr. Sims-Alvarado. Y'all, this is my girl right here. Reparations, the topic of reparations. As you know, across the country, the topic of reparations for African Americans have been usually left off the table, especially in places like New York, where just a few days ago, they were able to allocate $200 million to the descendants of the Holocaust, right? But yet, the descendants of Seneca Village for Central Park have not been discussed, right? So talk to us about what you're doing with the Fulton County Reparations Task Force and how the history of forced labor at the Chattahoochee Brick Company has impacted the local black community socially, economically, and politically.
Okay, let me see if I can get all of that in. So for those who don't know, I teach here at Morehouse, so whenever I get the chance, I say, you all are going to learn today. So, so forgive me if I go into teaching mode, but I'm the director of the public history program here. I'm also with the Africana Studies program, and I am a scholar activist like many of us in this room. And so regarding how the study for reparations, the reparations task force initiated by Fulton County came to be, let me just give you a little bit of context. As you all know, is that the fight for reparations has been going on for many decades. One may even say we can take it all the way back to 1865 when African Americans began to advocate for land, for economic autonomy. And so when you had the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau, one of the things that was in the title of the Freedmen's Bureau was about abandoned land. Okay, so the Freedmen's Bureau was responsible for assisting and providing for education, not completely, because many African Americans began to use resources within their own community in order to educate their own, but also to provide some health care and rations as people began to make this transition from slavery to freedom, particularly from people who were migrating across the South from the countryside to urban cities. But when people started talking about land and being self-sufficient, the word land disappeared. And so I want us to keep that in mind. We started looking at the long fight for restorative justice. But let me fast forward. You all familiar with Bruce's speech in LA County? Show of hands. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay. Don't be shy. Okay. So, but for those who don't know, there you go. It's coming back to you, right? So in LA County, there was an African American family, a little bit past the turn of the 20th century, that actually had land on the beach. And they had a business there. Long story short, this family was being intimidated, and they were forced off of their property. They became destitute. They lost their land. And the land, at one time, you start looking at what falls under the purview of local government. This becomes important to tie this in with what we're doing. At one time, the park was under the control of the city. Then it was transferred to the county, and then the state was over parks. So all of this is important. So what happened was that when the land was taken away, and when the superintendent of LA County came into power, white woman, she learned about Bruce's speech, and she saw how this family was wrong, and she used her power to return the property back to the family in order to make them whole. So she had to go to the city, had to go to the governor to try to make all of this work. But she used her power, okay? And that's what many of us don't do. She used her power as a way to correct the wrong to this family. So as this was going on in April of 2021, Marvin Arrington, who is a county commissioner, decided to use his power in order to author resolution to create a task force for Fulton County, the only county-led reparation task force in the United States. And people start saying, oh, why create this county-led task force? Some individuals said the fight is not on the local level, it's on the national level. Oh, well, we know how that's going, right? Okay? Any traction being made on the national level? Okay. So what happened was that the task force was created, but it was supported by 4 county commissioners. There's 7, okay? There's 4 African-American county commissioners, all right? So they approved the reparation task force. That was in April. There was no plan, no blueprint, no money to study reparations. How can you talk about reparations and there's no money involved, okay? So what happened was that it was in October that the first 4 task force members were appointed. Okay, so let's do the math. 7 commissioners, right? 4 approved it, 4 task force members. How many are missing? 3, okay? So for an entire year, there was 4 task force members taking on this task of advocating for reparations. So what happened, a year and a half passed around, I said, okay, we got to produce some results. Everyone else is receiving, the few task force that exist in the United States is receiving attention. We're Atlanta. Come on. We got to produce something. So over a course of 27 days, I said, okay, I got a plan. I began to look at when the county oversees began to make recommendations for its budget. Okay? So I said, okay, they've already made some recommendations in November, in December, but they make their final decision in January. So I said, okay, we got to put together a study. Over a course of 2 days, we put together a 27-page single-space report on what we had done up until this point. We had compiled together some research on 3 case studies and looking at convict labor, slavery, and eminent domain. So there were some individuals that had already started compiling research on the Chattahoochee Brick Company, Bagley Park, and we began to look at slavery. Now, you need to understand about slavery is that there's no seminal work written on slavery in Atlanta, okay? The most we probably know about slavery is what has been romanticized by Margaret Mitchell. We know all about Tara. So, we began to start putting together some information. And what we did was that we presented this report in January as the budget was being declared. And so I decided we were going to ask for $250,000. And one day I'll tell you all how I came up with that magic number. But I asked for $250,000. We presented the study, and we received the funding. This was during the same time that discussions were being had about the county jail. And people were putting the jail and reparations in the same sentence, as if somehow the jail is shelter for black people, okay? So, long story short, we put together, we got funding in order to do the study, but what we decided to do was to break the study up and looking at what falls under the purview of the county. Jails, voting, property taxes, libraries, the arts, and there's a couple other areas that I'm missing. And the reason why this study for reparations is going to be so important is because all throughout the United States, black people have paid for taxes and failed to receive full services. Am I right? Where's my amen choir? Okay? And there's the movement, the movement on the federal level is slow. So all movements start from grassroots movements, local movements, and every person in the United States lives in a county or a parish. And if you were to look at what we're creating, what we're trying to do is to create a blueprint. And people can plagiarize this study all they want to, I don't care. We may just leave it a blank. Say, put your county here. And if you look at what falls under the purview of the county, you can begin to see through the records that's available the injustices that exist in black and white. Our goal in this is to measure an injustice using quantitative and qualitative data. I think the universe prepared me for this. Yes, it has, right? And I'm not a scholar just to write books and become tenure. I'm coming to get justice. So I'm in right there.
All right. Thank you so much. Before we segue into Q&A, I have one more question for our entire panel. Would you all talk a bit more about why preserving this history is so important on a local and national level, and how were you all working collaboratively surrounding the Chattahoochee Brick Company? We could start with Professor Blackman to my right, and then proceed on over.
Well, it boils down to why this is also important. And I get asked that a lot. Or the way I get asked, the question I get the most is, why would a white guy like you, who grew up in the Mississippi, I am a white guy, if you didn't notice, who grew up in the Mississippi Delta, worked most of my career as a journalist at the Wall Street Journal, the most widely circulated, for a long time, conservative publication in the country, and some of that time working closely with Rupert Murdoch, of all people, And so why would I have written the book, Slavery by Another Name, or made the film based on that, or be involved in these other things? And the answer to that, the really personal answer to that, you can learn by watching my most recent film called The Harvest, which broadcasts on PBS in September, but that actually is sort of the story, in a way, of my childhood experiences in terms of being in the first class of children in Mississippi to begin the first day of first grade, black and white together, and going all the way through high school graduation in a fully integrated school environment. But so it's the story of that town, those kids. But the bigger answer to that, and to all of these things, is a simple one that we've all heard before, but can't be said too many times, and that is that if we don't understand this history, and not just for reasons of purely making right or balancing the books, those are very important things, but also just in the sense that if we don't understand the actual way that the world we live in now came to exist, if we're not able to be honest about what actually created the modern Atlanta, which fortunately in the last 40 years has been this leading light of effort and much success at finding the future that this society ought to want to have, the one that we live in. Atlanta has been this place that, even with all the various struggles it has had and is yet to have, is still this place that has attempted to be something that almost no other place in America or anywhere in the world has attempted to be. But that's been the story of Atlanta for the last 30 or 40 years. But the story before that, the story before Dr. King, is one that I often say to people is not a lot different from Birmingham or any of the other places that we like to remind people how bad they were, or how bad the things were that happened there. And so all the more so, so how did that happen? How did Atlanta go from being Birmingham into Atlanta? How did that happen? That's a positive story. That's an extraordinary story. But we also have to understand the Birmingham that Atlanta was before that, and that our whole society was. We have to understand why Henry Grady, who has all these things named after him, and this adored figure in so many circles in Atlanta, but was in fact the voice of apartheid. Is what he was. He was the voice of convincing people that there was a kind of racial subordination and horror that was acceptable somehow, and that African Americans should be amenable to that. But even more so when you come down to dollars, and dollars explain almost everything. I said that to the journalists I worked with and the students I worked with. If you're really trying to understand why anything has come to be, you have to find the money. You have to follow the money. But money explains so much. And the story of money in Atlanta is one that is all about the exploitation of African Americans, the theft of billions of dollars, trillions of dollars worth of labor from African Americans, and then the investment of that value into the creation of the modern city that we live in. And that was something that happened both in slavery times, but then happened maybe arguably on an even bigger scale after the end of slavery and all the way up into very modern times. And so it's about justice, and it's about sort of emotional things that relate to telling the truth, but it's also about just very material things, that if we want to be honest about why the world we live in is the way that it is, if we're honest about the things that we want the world to become, then we have to be honest about this history. We have to refuse to accept anybody who says, oh, well, there's no way to really figure that out. There's no way really to know how many people were arrested, how many people were injured, what the level of damage was done. There's no way to know whether Adair Park is named after the leading slave dealer in Atlanta, which it was, but people still will tell me today that that's not the case. That there's no way to know all of these things about our history, which in fact are knowable. And it's through the efforts of people who are at this conference on the panel here today. But it begins with that willingness to say, no, there are these things that we can know, and we can know them on a factual basis. So that's why.
Thank you.
Are we going this way? My great-great-grandparents were born into slavery in South Georgia. My great-great-grandfather died in 1936. My father was 3 years old. A person born into slavery held my father. My great-great-grandmother died in the early 40s, some years later. My great-grandparents, my grandfather's parents, were also born here in South Georgia and were sharecroppers. My grandfather was born in South Georgia to those sharecropping parents. They later moved to Central Florida, where my grandmother was born and where my father was born. They moved to New York in the late 30s, which is where I was born and raised. This is not an academic study for me. This is not some amorphous, wonder what it would be like thing to me. This is not even about justice for me. This is about the whole of Black history in this country. And it's really unfortunate that so many Black people I've met throughout my career in museums, predominantly, I've heard it said so often that, oh, well, we don't have history, we don't have culture, and then they go on to name these other groups of people like the Asians or like the Italians or like the whoever. And while there's a large part of our history that is very difficult to have to think about, to have to understand, to have to deal with, for better or for worse, it is our history. My grandfather, before he died in 2009, told me so many stories, but one of them sticks out in my mind. He remembers walking down a street in Sanford, Florida, as a young man before he and my grandparents moved to New York. And he had to get off the sidewalk because a white woman was approaching. I remember my grandmother as a little boy making fun of my grandfather in a weird kind of way, saying that he was afraid of white folks. And as a child, I didn't know what she was talking about. But when my grandfather told me a story about having to get off a sidewalk in Sanford, Florida, the same place Trayvon Martin was killed, where I still have family, with the understanding I had as an adult, I knew that my grandfather understood that had he not got off that sidewalk, he could have been lynched. I also understand and understood then that he knew how to navigate his environment, and had he not navigated that environment well, I might not be here. And so while I tell Black folks, while there's lots in our history in this country and in other countries around the world that is certainly difficult to have to deal with. I also know that there's an equal amount, perhaps even more, to be so proud of. I am so proud of people who understood their environment well enough to know how to survive and to know how to get to a point where someone like me could be born and others like me to continue to do the work that they started in very humble ways, but important ways. And so, although I'm not from Georgia, I am. And although I don't think I had relatives who labored at Chattahoochee Brick Company, they labored at places like Chattahoochee Brick Company, and they certainly labored for free in this country in slavery. And I'm proud of them because were it not for them, I would not be here. And so this effort that the city of Atlanta is undertaking with the folks here and many others, too many to name, is really important to me because it gives me an opportunity to help Black people think about our history in a different way. And it gives the city of Atlanta to reconcile its history in a way that perhaps it might not have had it not purchased that site. Thank you.
For me, it's really about, I consider this, the word that comes to mind is holy work, in the sense of that, I can't explain it the way I want to, but there's this belief of a person's name and how your name is connected to people before you were here, after you'll be here. And there's people's names associated with this site that have not been spoken in decades, centuries, a century. And I think around that, I also think about right now the fact that forced labor is still happening in this country, it's still happening in this state. My son plays soccer in Cartersville, and I'll never forget the first time we drove past that way of West Georgia, of West, watching people in cotton fields in 2023. And some of you may have also seen the article that was released last week from AP, making the connection to several large corporations whose headquarters are right up 285, and their practices of forced labor that are still happening today. And it enrages me what has been done to Black bodies. But one thing that me and my team, we talk about often, to echo what Anthony just laid out, is the resiliency of Black folks. There are stories associated with Chattahoochee Brick where they refused to work, where they said no, where they resisted. And those stories deserve to be told as well, and highlighted. So part of this collaboration is really in the spirit of lifting up these stories and honoring that spirit of resiliency and that spirit of resistance, and how we can do that together. Because to honor this history, I feel deeply, this is all of our job. Dr. Karcheik laid out, you're gonna learn today that we need you. We need people to get involved, to come to these sessions, to learn this history, but also to take ownership of it. Because we all Atlantans, this is our history. This is your site as well. And so how can you take ownership, accountability, and responsibility for the language around it, what will be on the site, and how people will interact with it? That is a job for all of us to do. And we're excited about that. We are on a lot of Zoom calls and team calls. Donna won't turn her camera on though, so I don't get to see her. But we do this work together because but we do this work together is because that's the only way it's going to get done. And that we know that there are so many moving pieces, but we know at the end of the day that who we're doing this for. And that we may not see the benefit, but we know that we're planting seeds that we may not see take root. And that, for me, is most inspiring, that my children will know this history, that they will be able to walk on this site and know that Atlanta decided to honor its history and to own the story of Chattahoochee Brick, of the people that labored here, of the men and women who bled and even died on this site. And I think that's the story, and that's the energy that we want to propel, and for that to be our story. So, thank you.
I've shared this before with my colleagues, that I'm beyond symbolic gestures. When I was first, so there's a story about how Donna and I became friends. It happened in the ladies' room, right? In the makeup room for your filming, right? The green room. So when I was first introduced about writing something about Chattahoochee Brick Company, I was asked to create a historic marker. I said, I'm gonna write this historic marker so they won't ask me again. And so I wrote in a way that I knew that they would say, oh my goodness, is she talking about us? And I said, this hit dog will holler. And so I wasn't asked to do it again. I don't think they asked anybody else again. When we did the documentary, we talked about what does the memorial look like? And I looked at Donna and I said, Donna, they're gonna ask you about a symbolic marker. Say no. This is what you want to ask for. So we talked about land and what a living memorial would look like. And I said, and I think what you need is guaranteed home loans with low interest, and your whole body language changed, right? Go back and look at the video. And I said, that sounds nice, right? And she says, oh, it's beautiful. So for me, I'm beyond the symbolic gestures. Oh, I'm over it. I'm about tangible results. How do we improve the quality of life of people who have a long history of oppression? And the people who sit at the table can no longer be the profiteers of our oppression. Do I need to say that again? There are people who capitalize off of our oppression, okay? And I'm over it, okay? So, Anthony, you mentioned Century, Florida. I grew up just about 15 minutes from there. Central, let's say Century, Florida. Well, where I grew up, it was the town, black, white, and Native Americans. Railroad track, whites lived on one side, Native Americans and blacks lived on the other side. And the main institution in the town was Holman Prison. It had the electric chair, and it was painted yellow from the yellow construction paint. And the electric chair was given this name of being like high yellow or something like that. It was in reference to a biracial woman, okay? And in this town, we often saw the convicts. They provided the labor for the black park. They dug the ditches because on the black and the Native American side, we did not have a sewer system. In my household, we didn't get an inside toilet until 1975. And I asked my mother just recently, how is it that we didn't have a toilet until 1975? She says, none of us did, because none of us was connected to the sewer system. And so when you begin to look at the role of convict labor, here you have individuals whose labor being exploited for services that was paid for by the citizens, okay? And so it gave me a whole different perspective, like, I mean, from childhood and understanding, like, what is going on with convict laborers. As I was leaving Alabama to come to Atlanta to go to school, on my way out, I saw a chain gang. And so this history is is connected to me in an intimate way. And for many of you, because almost every last one of us have a family member that's incarcerated, right? And there are some family members who never escape captivity. We find ourselves back in it. And we got to find a way. It's by design. And we have to find a way to break this system. So I'm going to stop right there, and I'm going to turn it over to my good friend.
I just want to let you guys know that you have put me in a very difficult place. You stole all my talking points. But I'm going to open up with one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite sheroes. I am not tragically colored, Zora Neale Hurston. I was introduced to Zora at Georgia State in my Black Women's Fiction course. Georgia State did not offer African American Studies classes. But me being the devious person that I was, I noticed that in the literature department, they had classes that had Black and African American and female in the titles. I said, oh, there's my minor right there. So I was introduced to Toni Morrison and Zora Neale Hurston and all these things. And there were people in our class that were Black and white people, and we were very diverse classes. And I say all that to say was, there was a question on Facebook, Skip Mason's page, not too long ago. And the question was, when did you have your first Black teacher? And me being the haughty person I was, I said, I had my first white teacher in the 4th grade. Yes, I went against the grain. And I'm saying that to let you guys know from where I came. I grew up with Newsweek and Time on the coffee table and Jet and Ebony on the coffee table. My grandparents, each of them had encyclopedias and dictionaries on the bookshelves and prominently displayed. And so did my dad. We all had globes. I know you guys probably don't know what a globe is, but it's a circular resemblance of the earth. Those things I've learned are predeterminers in your intelligence of your child. And as I grew older and older, kindergarten, I attended a small neighborhood school. Every day was Black History Day. I don't know how our teachers got away with this back then. It was the 70s. Maybe nobody was watching, but every day was Black History Day. I don't remember when I learned the national anthem, but I do remember when I learned the National Negro Anthem. All 5 verses. Like, we knew them all. I mean, it was that kind of school where every day was Black History Day. I remember learning Langston Hughes poems in County Cullen and people that people don't really recognize today because they've been, degraded. I say that to say this is where Chattahoochee Brick really resonated with me because that history. Because around 8th grade, suddenly I was in mainstream classes. And there wasn't a focus on African American studies or Black studies and things of that nature. And I remember starting 8th grade, and back then 8th grade was like you didn't go to elementary school anymore. You were going to middle school or high school. And I remember the kids on the bus talking about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and all Bill of Rights, and they had to learn all these things, and I was just sitting there like, I don't know if I'm gonna make it. Because I never had to learn those things. Until this day, I've never had to learn those things. When you have a foundation of who you are and from where you came, Anthony, because I'm even closer. My paternal great-grandmother was born into slavery. There's a story where she was going blind, and she came to visit her grandson, and they gave her to her, and she said, "Oh, this is a big boy right here." She was referring to my father. And even though the property, she bought property in Alabama, it's still in the family today. I'm saying that to say, learn who you are. Ask those questions. Everybody's not going to be, I believe, I did a family history project, and I was amazed at the number of people who didn't want to talk about it or couldn't talk about it because we were punished for sharing those stories with each other. But whatever little tidbits you get and whatever little tidbits you have, and this is Black History Month, and I understand and I respect Dr. King, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Rosa Parks. But dare yourself to learn about somebody you've never heard of before. Don't feed into that rhetoric that those are the only people who ever did anything. And go back to the continent. There are people there are people here today who know people who did something. There's somebody in your family that did something that was a first. And that's good and that's bad. Because we're talking about 2024. So challenge yourself to learn as much as you can, no matter who you are, whether it be your heritage, your religion, your culture, whatever. Just ask those questions. Because you'll feel better about who you are and where you are in this world. Because people are trying to tell you that you're from what kind of countries, that you don't mean anything, that you don't have anything, that you'll never be anything. But that's not true.
Amen.
You are somebody.